Hello again, Dan Alasso for Lifelong Learners and Making History, and I think I will probably post this book review in both places because it's not only part of my historiography, but it also deals very directly with the religion and politics question and with the capitalism question that I'm developing over on Making History. This is a book called The Market Revolution, Jacksonian America, 1815 to 1846, by Charles Greer Sellers, and it was published in 1991. And this was a book that I was very excited about reading when I was a PhD student preparing for my comprehensive exams. Sellers, who lived from 1923 to 2021, was a Bancroft Prize winner, and this book, published by the Oxford University Press, was called his most popular and was described as magisterial and a comprehensive story of the triumph of the capitalist market over agrarianism. And I thought maybe Jefferson's vision in the first half of the 19th century. And its start was promising. Sellers said right at the beginning, history's most revolutionary force, the capitalist market, was wresting the future from history's most conservative force, the land. And this book is still actually very well regarded, and it's recommended for popular audiences because of its comprehensiveness and its accessibility. According to Wikipedia, the book was originally commissioned to be part of the Oxford History of the United States series, but its criticism of the historiographical ideal of consensual democratic capitalism in the U.S. led the Oxford University Press to publish it outside the series. One of the book's central arguments is that historians have largely ignored the stressed and resistant Jacksonian majority, choosing instead to sing the praises of capitalism and ignore the evidence that democracy in the U.S. rose largely in resistance to capitalism rather than in accord with it. Sellers' book, which synthesized a wealth of extremely diverse sources to make its case, has profoundly impacted all subsequent debates surrounding the market revolution in the United States. Now, that's not entirely true, I don't think. And so I want to comment on it and kind of put the book in the context that it deserves and deflate some of these huge claims for it. Because as things turned out, I wasn't as thrilled with the book as I had hoped to be. The sweeping and comprehensive nature of the narrative, I thought, oversimplified the story really a bit too much. And although I could deal with the slight determinism that Sellers brought into the storytelling from Karl Marx, the thing I really objected to was all the theology. The centuries of peasant animism Sellers described sounded remarkably like Carolyn Merchant, whose book Ecological Revolutions, which I had really disliked, was actually the first volume cited in Sellers in his bibliographical essay at the end of the book. And Protestantism's antipodal heresies, in his words, of antinomianism and Arminianism were never really clearly explained, nor were they shown to be either a cause or an effect. Sellers simply said, quote, the awakening had an ultimately profound political effect without really completely explaining the sources of the Second Great Awakening or considering other sources of the challenges to deferential social organization that emerged in the Revolutionary era. Sellers wavered between a sort of determinist conspiracy theory in which, he said, lawyers were the shock troops of capitalism, and a religious drama where Jonathan Edwards's revolutionary new light, as finely modulated to the stresses of capitalist accommodation by Finney's genius, nerved Americans for the personal transformation required by a competitive market. Neither explanation was satisfying to me, but along the way there was plenty of interesting information that I was able to look into further. The Jeffersonians in Sellers' book were not selfless heroes. In 1802, Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin, quote, convinced Congress to allocate land revenues from the new state of Ohio for a national road connecting it with the Potomac via southwestern Pennsylvania, where his own investments were concentrated. And then the 14th Congress, convening in prosperous peace in December 1815, was filled with enterprise-minded lawyers who took credit for saving the Republic from the military ineptitude of penny-pinching, old-fogey republicanism. The transition from the Jefferson to the Madison Democratic Republicans, and then to the younger generation, John Quincy Adams, etc., was interesting and probably did have some insights and story ideas within it. Monroe, quote, falling $1,000 in debt to the bank, that would be the second bank's chief promoter, John Jacob Astor, who regularly subsidized his habit of living beyond his means, was also very interesting, especially to me in my ongoing project to trace the origins of plutocracy in America. But Sellers continued. The Adamses epitomized both the fruits and the human costs of self-repressive effort exacted by capitalist transformation. The sublimation of psychic energy that fueled the country's astonishing surge of production also generated the emotional intensity that John Quincy Adams displaced onto his beloved republic. I agree. The Adams family was a bit nuts, but seriously, what do these sentences even mean? And how accessible is this really to the average reader? I think the story flowed much more smoothly when Sellers described events like the dramatic reversal of Republican tradition, where, in President Madison's words, Republicans were, quote, reconciled to certain measures and arrangements which may be as proper now as they were premature or suspicious when urged by the champions of federalism. Sellers has a keen sense of irony. This was a beautiful explanation of the role of parties in American politics. In another ironic passage, Sellers described Senator John Taylor, that is Taylor of Caroline, and his 1814 inquiry into the principles and policy of the United States. Taylor's analysis of capitalist exploitation of American agricultural labor anticipates Marx, Sellers suggested. But it's also absurd. He says, this doomed aristocrat, elaborating the labor theory of value while slave labor supplied his every want, epitomized the contradictions of the capitalist transformation. Sellers was right. There is huge irony here. And this is a tension that I always kind of noticed when I'm reading people like Eric Foner. Is it actually possible, I wonder, for a group as off-the-charts wrong as Southern congressmen were to articulate a valid indictment of Northern wage-based industry? And if not, is part of the tragedy of the antebellum period the fact that there was really no one in politics who was in a credible position to say what needed to be said about the way that capitalist institutions were developing? Is that a lesson of American politics in this period? That both sides were so compromised that there was never any pure ground to stand on, so you had to make your choice of the lesser evil? Did people at the time get this? Rotation in office became the spoils system under Jackson. Was anyone really surprised? Sellers said, it is not surprising that the state banks, most having suspended specie payments during the war, were reluctant to resume redeeming their notes in gold and silver coin on demand. With specie payments suspended, new banks could open on no other capital than stock loans and a little borrowed specie, and then force their notes into circulation by lending freely. Established banks could earn dividends of 12 to 20% by extending loans and note issues far beyond their specie reserves. The resulting uncontrolled inflation threatened sound growth, Sellers said. But of course, it seemed like a good idea at the time to each person who took the notes or loans from their eager local banker. The question Sellers didn't really address was, how was it that these banks were allowed to do this? There was more going on than just an old-fashioned culture, the kind in which Jefferson had co-signed his friend Nicholas's loan and lost his fortune, that doesn't understand what's happening, isn't there? Sellers should probably have done a little more reading in banking history. And this is a criticism that I often have of historians who are trying to deal with this issue. In 1818, quote, with Henry Clay as its well-rewarded supervising attorney, the National Bank began ruthlessly stripping its Western debtors of their property. This is the new national bank, the second bank. Most of Cincinnati fell into its hands. As a result, General William Henry Harrison, popular hero of Tippecanoe, bank director, and longtime grandee, was hard run for the state senate by an upstart radical lawyer and hero of the city's working class. Sellers did not give this opponent a name, but it sounds like an interesting story. As does the idea that image politics began in 1928, when, quote, farmers and workers were baffled as well as threatened by the abstraction and complexity of the interests and issues that engaged calculating elites. And as a result, Jackson's charisma froze voters into a pattern of party identifications favoring his entourage. Really? Were the issues really that difficult? Were the people really that dim? Who then was the audience for the self-taught mechanic/intellectual William M. Gouge's 1833 bestseller, A Short History of Paper Money and Banking? So when Jackson vetoed the second bank's recharter, was he leading or following? The rhetoric was right on target. The rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Many of our rich men have not been content with equal protection and equal benefits, but have besought us to make them richer by act of Congress. But if, in Sellers' words, the bank war was an acid test of American democracy, how is it that no one in Jackson's administration understood what throwing control back to mostly unregulated state banks was going to do to the money supply? It's hard to see how anyone believed that without some other controls, the result would be a return to metallic, real money. Either part of the story is missing, or somebody's not being honest. Legislatures chartered over 200 new banks in 3 years, Sellers said, pushing the total to over 600. As the money supply, banknotes, deposits, and circulating specie, swelled from 172 million in 1834 to 276 million in 1836, prices shot up 50%. And at this point, Sellers forgot to mention credit notes, which were used everywhere and functioned as cash. Thomas Hart Benton complained, "I did not join in putting down the Bank of the United States to put up a wilderness of local banks. I did not join in putting down the paper currency of a national bank to put up a national paper currency of 1,000 local banks." Then why did he do it? What had he expected? The specie circular was overturned in Congress in December 1836 by Whigs and what Sellers calls conservative Democrats. And, quote, Jackson's last official act was a pocket veto sustaining his hard money policy against the bipartisan dismay of politicians. Jackson came to Washington as the result of the Panic of 1819, and he left after setting off the Panic of 1837. Economic disaster and multiplying immigrants, Sellers said, from 38,914 in 1838 to 104,565 in 1842, soon brought plebeian nativism to a boil and launched America on its irrevocable path toward urban industrial capitalism, Sellers said. Really? The U.S. population in the 1840 census totaled 17,069,453. What Sellers implies was an 1842 tsunami of immigration amounted to less than 1% of the total population. Even if the immigrants had all arrived in and had all remained in New York City, which they didn't, they would have made up only 25% of that city's population. A little more engagement with nuts and bolts and a little less psychodynamics would have made this a more readable and persuasive book. But they didn't ask me. In 1992, the Journal of the Early Republic invited a panel to participate in a symposium on this Market Revolution book. Somehow, the journal managed to not invite a number of social historians who had actually been working on the market revolution for decades. But many of these historians would have a chance to be heard in Stokes and Conway's 1996 book, which I'll review next. Kicking off the commentary was Richard Ellis, who was a former student of Sellers, who said that although the book, in his words, did not pay the careful attention to detail in the way people had come to expect from Sellers. Nonetheless, his comprehensiveness and aggressive presentation of meaningful and provocative generalizations will act as a catalyst for numerous doctoral dissertations. This is actually a backhanded compliment, I think. Ellis was suggesting that a whole generation of grad students was about to rise up to correct Sellers' errors and misstatements. Mary Blewett then hinted that social historians had already moved well beyond Sellers and that they would be frustrated and disappointed by his synthesis. Joel Silby subtly suggested that Sellers was simply following a line of argument, quote, so well explored and synthesized previously by Harry Watson, who, in his own blurb of the book, had called it a brilliant achievement, combining vast scholarship with vivid, trenchant prose. But then, in his turn, Watson reminded readers that resistance to the market transition had already been discussed in terms Sellers had used by real social historians, such as Henrietta, Clark, Kulikov, etc. In a defense that was printed after these criticisms in the same issue, Sellers admitted that the theologisms were daunting, but he said that was the way it had to be. He reiterated his belief that, quote, the Protestant tension between antinomianism and Arminianism was the central tension in early American life. Religion was important and, quote, demands the special attention of historians because through it, as through politics, the largest numbers of people most visibly register their reactions to their circumstances. And this was probably my biggest issue with Sellers' approach. Politics is an imperfect mirror of regular people's ideas about life and society because they most often are choosing from a set menu, or between the giant douche and the turd sandwich, to put it in South Park terminology. But at least there were no major institutional barriers to political participation if you were white and male. Regular people were at least theoretically eligible to play. This is not the case with religion. The whole point of the religious game is control from above. Even where the message is individual, internal salvation through grace, the medium is still almost always an elite white guy in the pulpit, who the lay people are indoctrinated to believe and to follow. Nothing could be more liberating for American historians, Sellers said, than recognizing our own embeddedness in the liberal ideology we should be subjecting to critical analysis. Now, I don't disagree with this, but the same goes for Sellers' own embeddedness in his theological worldview. And I think this has interesting implications for the present, where people's own embeddedness in religious or in irreligious worldviews are taking them to places that would be better if they were examined. So I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.